All right. Wow. Great turnout. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, do we have any announcements or kudos to throw out to the crowd here? No? Okay. Well, I guess I'll just say congratulations to all of you students and professors who made it through another calendar year of academia. Although not quite, because we still have finals, but classes ended this week, so congratulations to everybody. Okay, well, on behalf of the School of Geography, Development, and Environment and the Southwest Center, I want to welcome everyone to the 14th annual My Arizona Lecture. My name is Geoff Bannister, and I'm the director of the Southwest Center and an associate research professor here in the School of Geography. And assisting me today is the outreach coordinator of the Southwest Center, Don Carlos Quintero, running the electronica and stuff. So. Okay, so before we get started here, I would like to remind everyone that the University of Arizona occupies the territory of the Tohono O'odham, Pasquayaqui, and Apache peoples. We respect their cultures and histories and acknowledge that the appropriation of their lands and waters forms the historical geographic basis of the territory today known as Arizona. Okay, so the idea for the My Arizona Lecture was launched by my geography colleagues, Sally Marston, who is back here today, J.P. Jones also, and Dr. Diana Liverman, who several years ago started talking about how, as a school, we might create a space for showcasing Arizona's great historical complexity and the biocultural diversity for broader audiences. So the first lecture was given by Dr. Julio Betancourt, a lead scientist and, among other things, a paleoclimatologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. And then since that time, we've had a huge diversity of amazing and illustrious My Arizona lecturers. And I'm just going to read to you the list here very briefly. So it includes Dr. Maribel Alvarez, my colleague in the Southwest Center and also in the School of Anthropology, Corky Poster in architecture, Allison Deming in English, Chris Impey, astronomy, Laura Lopez Hoffman, Udall Center in the School of Natural Resources and Environment, Thomas Sheridan, also my colleague in the Southwest Center and in the School of Anthropology, Ellen McMahon in the School of Art, David Yetman in the Southwest Center, Barbara Atwood in law, Rebecca Sosi, also in law, Scott Warren, an autonomous geographer based in Ajo and also who teaches for the School of Geography as well. And then Matthew Sakiestua Gilbert, who is in American Indian Studies. So this has been a very amazing lecture series. We've had some really interesting talks, and I have no doubt that today will be on a par with all the rest of them, because we are greatly honored to have with us Dr. Geoff Boyce, an alum of the School of Geography and the current academic director and faculty of the Earlham College Border Studies program here in Tucson. And in some ways, this lecture marks a kind of bittersweet occasion because Geoff and his partner, Dr. Sarah Lanius, also an alum from the school, Geoff will be leaving us to take up a position. Well, we'll be leaving Tucson for Ireland to take up a new assistant professor post at the University College of Dublin in the School of Geography. So in some ways, this talk is kind of a bon voyage for one person, and definitely two ultimately. I know that Geoff, you and Sarah are going to probably be doing this in phases, moving in phases. But this is a bon voyage for two people whose contribution to the Tucson community and borderlands as scholars, activists, shapers of public policy, and teachers have been enormous. So I'd just like to applaud you. So Dr. Geoff Boyce, a political geographer and polymath, is a longtime student of the social, cultural, and political dynamics of the US-Mexico borderlands. Like me, he is also part of Sally Marston's hyper-extended family of geography scholars. having defended his dissertation in 2016 with Sally as chair and with committee members Liz Oglesby, Miranda Joseph, and J.P. Jones. His dissertation oeuvre is called Over the Line, Homeland Insecurity and the United States Expanding Borderlands, which is available now through the University of Arizona libraries. And maybe somewhere else, I don't know. Since then, Geoff has researched and published widely, bringing much, I was going to say wildly, that's probably true too. Bringing much needed understanding and attention to the injustices of borderlands militarization and exploring, frequently in collaboration with others, the borderlands region from several different angles. This is something that I always admire with Geoff's work, is just the multitude of different ways that Geoff is trying to understand the very complex dynamics of the borderlands. And Geoff's curriculum vitae contains numerous publications, and here I just selected a few because they seem pretty indicative, or you know, in a lot of ways, actually some of the most creative titles I've seen. So, and also indicative of Geoff's penchant for collaborating with other researchers. So in 2022, Geoff published, or is going to publish soon, Common Immunity or Microbial Xenophobia, Nation-State Boundary Controls and the Spread of Disease in the Era of COVID-19 in ACME, an International Journal for Critical Geographies. Along with Sam Chambers, in 2021 came the Corral Apparatus, or the Corral Apparatus, Counterinsurgency and Architecture, and the Architecture of Death and Deterrence along the Mexico-United States border, and that just got published in Geoforum in 2021. With Sam Chambers as lead author, Geoff, along with Daniel Martinez in sociology here at the University of Arizona, published Climate Impact or Policy Choice, the Spatiotemporality of Thermoregulation and Border Crosser Mortality in Southern Arizona. So glad I got through that, okay. And then Boyce again, sole author, Home Interrupted, Crises of Social Reproduction, Mutual Aid, and the Transformation of Place in the Aftermath of an Immigration Arrest. And that is once again in ACME. So I only have 10 more pages of this to read. With Geoff's partner, Dr. Sarah Lanius, they published More Than a Metaphor, Settler Colonialism, Frontier Logic, and the Communities of Racialized Dispossession in a Southwest US city. And that came out in our discipline's flagship journal, The Annals of the American Association of Geographers. And then in 2018 comes Geoff's sole authored publication, Appearing Out of Place, Automobility and the Everyday Policing of Threat and Suspicion in the US-Canada Frontier. And finally, we have, with Jesse Miner, very interesting piece. Jesse Miner is lead author in 2018, Smokey Bear and the Pyropolitics of United States Forest Governance, and that appeared in Political Geography. So a pretty amazing diversity and range of academic work. Okay, so before I turn things over to Geoff, I just want to say quickly, we have a very large online audience today. So what we're going to do at the end, we'll have plenty of time for question and answer, and I will field those with the microphone. So please just wait for me, and I'll come over to you as quickly as I can. And we want to do that just to make sure that everybody online can hear us and in this room as well. And then Carlos is going to help us field questions online as well. And I suspect it's going to be a little tricky to get everyone in there because I know that there will be a lot of questions. So, okay, with that, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Geoff Boyce.
As if I'm talking at this volume with this level of amplification, can people hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you so much to Geoff and to the Southwest Center and to the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment, and to all of you for being here today. It's almost, it's humbling, I guess, have someone read out all the work you've been doing. But it really is a privilege to have been invited today to give this talk and to be with you all. So I want to begin with a quote from the great abolitionist in geography, Ruthie Gilmore, who talks about how the selection and reselection of ancestors is one of the most consequential political choices that any of us makes as part of what she calls the radical process of finding anywhere, if not everywhere, in political practice and analytical habit that we can occupy. And I think what she means by this is that really we are each of us a product of our relationships, but we also have the opportunity and responsibility to embrace and situate ourselves in lineage with others. And I think this is a foundational way in which we can orient ourselves. And I'm bringing this observation really into into my presentation, and beginning with this because I feel a need to acknowledge that there are many people with whom I am in lineage in this room, people who either as mentors or elders or teachers have really profoundly shaped who I am and the way that I see and interact with in the world. So I really am grateful and privileged to have been invited to give this talk today. And as Geoff mentioned, I am in my own life in a moment of transition. And so I've been really reflecting on some of the things that I've lived in Arizona for more than 20 years. I've lived here in Tucson since 2005. And I've been in a process of really reflecting on how this place has shaped me and what are some of the key lessons that I want to take away and hold on to as an orienting foundation as I move into the next kind of moment of my life. And so I thought I would use this opportunity of this talk to share some of these lessons that I think are meaningful for me with all of you. And I think they are meaningful also for the country and the world as we collectively move through what is becoming an increasingly turbulent period of history. And one of the reasons why I think there's a great deal to be learned here is that in many ways, I think that this region, Southern Arizona and the Arizona-Sonora borderlands, can really be viewed as a microcosm where a whole host of issues and dynamics that are global in scope come together and converge, but also as another person who I'll claim as an ancestor, really an elder, has long pointed out, Arizona has a long track record of being a laboratory for policies and practices that are later exported elsewhere. So this is a kind of something that Isabel Garcia, a leader in this community, has long insisted upon. And a lot of my academic work was actually inspired by that argument and a desire to go out and explore the expansion. Let's see, the expansion of border policing and infrastructures of border militarization that have first been pioneered and normalized in Southern Arizona into other areas of the country, and also to look at what are the ramifications, right, as these infrastructures that in many ways have become part of the fabric of this place wind up in places where they are experienced as substantively new. But I think we can observe the way that policies, models of governance, and power relations first pioneered in this region, later become exported in a number of other areas. And I mean, one kind of really significant one that goes back a little ways in history, right, is the model of export processing zones that has really shaped the borderlands, particularly northern Mexico, the economy, the fabric of urban areas, and so on, right? The export processing model actually begins in Ireland, but very early on it's taken up through the border industrialization project in this border region, and then exported all around the world as one of the bedrock elements of globalization. We can think about this as well with policies like SB 1070, which after being passed in Arizona in 2010, of course, this was the really aggressive anti-immigrant law that mandated that all police in the state of Arizona at all times cooperate with federal immigration authorities. And after being passed here, copycat laws then were adopted in states like Georgia, Alabama, Indiana, Utah, Texas. And we can also think about this in relation to this current moral panic that has been drummed up within right-wing networks around quote-unquote critical race theory, which has really been used as a kind of generic umbrella term to capture any type of educational content addressing issues of race, identity, historical and contemporary injustice, and so on. And Tucson and the state of Arizona were pioneers in this conflict and in using this as a kind of wedge electoral issue. And I think it's worth pointing out that after leaving the superintendent of public education role in the state of Arizona, where Tom Horn shepherded through the ban on ethnic studies in the state of Arizona, he has now just been reelected, right? So these issues are by no means behind us, as I will continue to discuss. And so all this is just to say that Arizona is on the front lines of a whole host of national and global issues, which means that I think there are lessons that can be learned here related to confronting these issues that have widespread application across the country and globally. So I'll proceed by naming just a few. The first, and this is really a lesson in perspective that I've learned from people like Raquel Rubio Goldsmith and Lupe Castillo. North America is a shared space, and the border plays a pivotal role in producing and disseminating inequality in this space. And this is true in a deep historical sense. If we look at historical patterns of movement, trade, cultural exchange, linguistic practice, and so on, these, for the overwhelming majority of the history of this place, have proceeded according to patterns of mobility and relationships that were substantively north-south in character as opposed to east-west. And any type of east-west type of dynamic is really reflects, I think, in many ways, the idiom of manifest destiny, right? And is a much more recent overlay on top of a deeper, like I said, historical pattern. And to this day, right, we see this in the intimate aspects of people's families, lives, and livelihoods. And we need only consider, riffing on Mike Davis, for example, how there are, 400,000, give or take, Salvadorans living in the city of LA, making Los Angeles, in a sense, the second largest Salvadoran city after San Salvador. And if you take into consideration the 2.4 million Salvadoran citizens living in the United States, a quarter of all Salvadorans live in this country. Hundreds of thousands of Mexican-born persons live in cities like LA and Chicago. Roughly 10% of the population of Mexico lives on this side of the border. And this speaks of nothing of the US capital that defines the livelihoods and work opportunities in these countries, or the cultural impact and how generational patterns of migration are, in fact, today transforming everyday life in all of these countries. Now, I think this is an everyday lived reality that many people here in Southern Arizona understand, but I think it's one that tends to become almost incomprehensible to many people the further away from the border that you travel. And in fact, I think that a lot of the politics driving border militarization is premised on an imaginary that we, and here I'm obviously speaking generally of people in the United States, can meaningfully separate ourselves from the rest of the world, that our lives, our economies, our societies are not always already entangled in ways that are constitutive, in other words, that define us, even if they're riddled with inequalities of wealth, power, and opportunity. So, we'll come back to this in a moment. As mentioned, the border also plays a pivotal role in producing this inequality. So this is something that I think we can best appreciate when we attend to the issue of social reproduction, which is an analytical framework that Strauss and Meehan defined as one that foregrounds the interaction of paid labor and unpaid work in the reproduction of bodies, households, communities, societies, and environments in ways in which, and the ways in which these activities are organized to support or undermine human flourishing. In other words, as generations of feminist scholars remind us, and of course among these I have to mention Cindy Katz and people like Cindy Katz and Sally Marston, if we understand that paid labor or people's labor power is fundamental to profit and accumulation under capitalism, then we have to recognize the fundamental role of unpaid labor that goes into reproducing human beings who are capable of showing up for work each day and the next day and the day after that, and so on, in both an everyday and a generational time frame. So in light of all of this, if we focus on those intimate practices and relationships through which people produce and sustain their lives, we can better appreciate, I think, how the border acts as a structuring agent, imposing violence not so much to meaningfully or categorically block, constrain, or separate people as to define the conditions under which we are allowed to live, love, and work. And we need only consider how, as economic crises, environmental crises, and neoliberal restructuring have driven millions of people from their homes and livelihoods over the past several decades, many millions of people have migrated north, either to the border itself or to the United States, not so much as the only way to make ends meet, as the most viable basis to save money, subsidize rural livelihoods, support ailing loved ones, provide for children's education, purchase land, purchase a home, open a business, or otherwise to afford that whole array of necessities that increasingly have come to be indispensable within a global consumer landscape. And what results, and what has resulted, are millions of families whose means of routine and generational social reproduction circulate across transnational space. And to illustrate this point, I'll briefly draw our attention to the June 2022 tragedy in San Antonio, Texas, where 56 migrants died and another 16 were rescued after being trapped inside a tractor trailer while attempting entry to the United States. As tragic as these circumstances were, the scale of this tragedy also led to widespread media coverage, and a theme that emerged repeatedly in interviews with family members was the centrality of their journey, both for the ongoing survival of families and for their future hopes. And so, for example, the Washington Post reported the story of Jose Luis Vasquez Guzman, who survived the tragedy, and his cousin Javier Flores Lopez, who did not. Flores Lopez was back from the United States, where he was living in the state of Ohio to visit his wife and 3 children. And both of them hoped to return to the state of Ohio. And narrating their reasons for leaving their home, or for leaving on the journey, their shared cousin, Alejandro Lopez, described in the community Cerro Verde, where they were from, that most people live on less than 30 pesos a day, which is about $1.50. And he said, quote, "Here the options are: 1, be a police officer, join the military, or go to the United States." And incidentally, these 2 cousins, this community, they were from Cerro Verde. It's a village of about 60 people nestled between Teotitlán de Flores Magón and Eloxochitlán de Flores Magón in the state of Oaxaca. These are the places of birth and childhood of the famous Mexican revolutionary brothers, Jesus, Enrique, and Ricardo, respectively. And then there is the story of Alejandro Miguel Andino Caballero, 23 years old, and Margui Tamara Paz Grajeda, 24 years old. They were a young couple with degrees in marketing and economics who, according to the Associated Press, traveled to the United States after years of applying for jobs in Honduras, but repeatedly failing to obtain stable employment, right? And a quote from the mother of the young man, who says, "We planned it together as a family so that they could have a different life, so that they would achieve their goals and dreams." And she concludes her comment saying, relaying how she had reassured Alejandro Miguel about the journey, saying, you are not the first, nor will you be the last human being to travel to the United States, which speaks to how routine these migration practices are for so many families. And finally, as an example, there's a story of Alejandro Miguel Andino Caballero. There's a story of Pascual Melvin Guachiac, who was a 13-year-old Maya Quechua boy from the department of Sololá, Guatemala, whose journey, together with that of his cousin Juan Wilmer Tululta Paz, were financed by family and neighbors who pooled resources to pay the $10,000 that each had to pay for the trip. They mortgaged their homes and land with the expectation that they'd be able to pay down the debt via wages earned here in the United States once they successfully arrived. And to drive this point home on the role of migration in sustaining people's lives and the broader kind of conditions under which extended families are surviving and planning for the future, we can also just consider the massive scale of remittances from wages earned in the United States that are routinely transferred to countries in Mexico, Central America, South America, and all over the world. This is an older slide from 2013, but during the pandemic, this is a graph based on data from the IMF, and that comes from a report looking at the role of remittances sent back from the United States and in people's survival during the first year and a half of the pandemic, when so many, millions of people here, but all over the world, were thrown out of work, and particularly people whose livelihoods were based on informal economic activity, right, had then, very little access to income. So this is how people survived, or one of the ways that people survived. So on the one hand, as Douglas Massey has observed, as the border has become more militarized, beginning in the 1990s, and the transnational journey became more difficult and expensive, this led to an end to the previous dominant patterns of cyclical migration and more families permanently settling in the United States, and spouses, children coming to join loved ones who were already here. And on the other hand, if we follow the work of people like Richard Johnson and Murphy Woodhouse, we can observe how border militarization and the increasing difficulty of the journey also result in identifiable patterns of landscape change and further rounds of livelihood disruption and dispossession in rural areas, which likely drive still further patterns of outmigration. Now, the fact that as a result of the border and the impediments it imposes, patterns and practices of social reproduction have become spatially separated and transnational in scope has long been commented on in the scholarly literature. And so now I want to pivot to commenting on Michael Burroway's foundational article in the 1970s, which was part of a vigorous body of intellectual work during this period, which went into out of which the first efforts emerged to name the concept and phenomenon of racial capitalism, which is to say, a way of thinking about the entanglements of racial governance, labor, and social reproduction, focusing specifically on the apartheid regime in South Africa. And Michael Burroway's work undertakes a comparative approach looking at the similarities between the Bantustan system of labor management in South Africa and the condition of migrant agricultural workers in the US Southwest, particularly in places like California. And I think all of this affords us a way of conceptualizing how differences of race and status are produced and instrumentalized, not just as a way to justify primitive accumulation, in other words, displacement and dispossession, or to rationalize various forms of violence and abandonment, but also, as Diego Martinez Lugo and I have been exploring, as a way of maximizing the accumulation of surplus value by diminishing the cost and value of labor power, by rendering a significant cross-section of the US working class deportable and therefore disposable. And in fact, in some of my own research, which I undertook with the support of and involvement of Sarah Lanius, who is currently the City of Tucson's Director of Community Safety, Health, and Wellness, we've shown how the simple fact of an immigration arrest and detention, regardless of whether or not a person is ultimately deported, can result in massive financial losses that accumulate to their household, and which then have significant gendered and generational repercussions as different family members reshuffle responsibilities for caregiving, work, and income, which then results in abandoning educational pursuits, selling off basic assets like personal vehicles, and adopting other kinds of cost-cutting measures within their household, chief among which include taking on additional hours at work, additional employment, just in order to make ends meet. And I'll share a couple of quotes from qualitative interviews with residents of Pima County here, discussing how an immigration arrest within their family resulted in really narrating these changes within their household and the impacts on younger children, on their educational pursuits, and so on. So in other words, by refusing to guarantee people's social reproduction, by explicitly excluding them from public services, education, formal employment, and other benefits, by saddling people with massive financial costs, and that most other working families are spared from simply because they are not US citizens, people are compelled to work more and harder at lower pay and under worse conditions, and as a result, capital, right, employers are able to obtain their labor at a discount. Now, of course, this is a broad sketch, and I'm attempting to weave a bunch of things together, but I'm laying this out here because I think all this affords us a basis for rethinking the role of the border in our lives overall, one that allows for an analytical connection between contemporary patterns of migration and broader and border governance and previous eras of racial oppression, broadly and in the US Southwest specifically, forms of oppression that hinged explicitly on differentiating people's access to rights and public infrastructure and economic opportunity, and by doing so amplified their exposure to precarity and exploitation. But all of this also, I think, helps draw attention to how the divisions imposed by the border are never just territorial or geopolitical, but they're also intimate. They permeate people's homes, their families, our neighborhoods, our places of work and worship. And here it's just worth observing that according to the Pew Hispanic Center, some 80% of undocumented people in the US live in what are defined as mixed status households. So these are families that include at least one US citizen or lawful permanent resident. So in other words, I think that this is something many of us here in Southern Arizona also understand, or at least have come to understand, that the border does not meaningfully separate, quote, us and quote, them, but rather it shapes everyday forms of precarity and insecurity and violence that certainly affect some of us much more than others, but that ultimately impact everyone. It impacts the fabric of our communities, of our institutions, and of the everyday conditions of life in which many of us live. And this then, I think, provides a different kind of normative basis, right, foundation for challenging this violence, which brings me to the next point, which is that there is power in community. And to illustrate this, I want to start by showing this chart. These are nationwide notices to appear. This is a graph that shows us a notice to appear as the initiation of a deportation proceeding. So this essentially speaks to an initial immigration arrest of a person. And you can see that there is a pretty substantial increase in NTAs during the Trump administration, specifically 2018 and 2019. And you see the same pattern in the Tucson Immigration Court deportation proceedings that are initiated here in Southern Arizona. There is a meaningful increase in 2019, 2020, but the peak, right? There's a much higher pattern of arrest and initiation of deportation proceedings in 2009, 2010, 2011. And in fact, a very substantive decline after that. And this didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It was a result of a groundswell of mobilization following SB 1070, which included things like the We Reject Racism campaign, which then led to a series of stop deportation campaigns, which then informed the foundation of the Keep Tucson Together immigration clinic, and all of which then contributed national pressure to the Obama administration initiating a prosecutorial discretion policy, which which actually carved out categories of persons who would be exempt from deportation in the United States. Also, Tucson was a hub early on for nationwide mobilizing and protest and direct action by networks of dreamers, young people who were undocumented, which also then culminated in 2012 in the occupation of Obama for America campaign offices. And 2 days after that wave of occupations was launched, the White House then came out with what is today the DACA policy, which was really a direct response to that mobilization. In Tucson, in this period, there was also a reanimation of the tactic of sanctuary, which then expanded all across the United States. Finally, well, not finally, because there's many other things I could spend time commenting on, but in this era, in the aftermath of SB 1070, there was a proliferation of grassroots protection networks, which explicitly and formally created infrastructures of mutual aid to reduce people's vulnerability to deportation and to the repercussions of an immigration arrest so that they could fight their deportation. And this combined with, sorry, this slide's out of place. This is the Keep Tucson Together Community Immigration Clinic with, you can see the great work that folks do there, maximizing people's ability to fight their deportation cases through volunteers, like some of you in this room. And this combined with direct action, grassroots protest and pressure, and a lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union resulted in February 2015 in the city of Tucson revising its standing orders for the Tucson police, limiting the police officers' cooperation with the Border Patrol and with ICE. And so in addition to this policy change, everything I've been reviewing also created material infrastructures that substantively reduced people's vulnerability to arrest and improved their ability to successfully defend themselves in the eventuality that they are arrested. And we can appreciate the impact of this when we look back to this graph of deportation proceedings and then look at the number of deportation proceedings that actually resulted in deportation, right? Versus proceedings that resulted in relief, right? People winning their case and being able to remain in the United States, right? There's been a substantial increase over time in people's success in remaining with their home in their homes with their families here. And of course, all of this work that I've been reviewing builds on a longer history of struggles around intersecting issues that range from mine worker struggles throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even going further back in time. Farm worker organizing in the 60s and 70s, the Central American Solidarity and Sanctuary movements of the 1980s, in which organizers in Tucson, of course, played an instrumental role. Human rights and humanitarian initiatives to document and address the tremendous loss of human life here in the desert borderlands, which include groups like No More Deaths and the Samaritans. And this brings me to the next lesson that I want to highlight for all of us here, which is that change is inevitable. And I think this is an important thing to bear in mind, particularly when it comes to the topic of border militarization. I always find it really important to talk about this and to talk about how recent so much of this infrastructure is. Right? We don't see a really substantial increase in the building out of walls in the Arizona borderlands until 2006. Right? But we don't, there really isn't any meaningful wall building in our border communities until here in Arizona until the late 1990s, which is within the lifetime of most of us in this room. There's been a very rapid, recent, massive expansion in the budget, the technology, the person power available to agencies like the Border Patrol and the Department of Homeland Security. But for much of our history and much of our recent history, the border looked very different, right? This is a recent imposition. And I think it's also important to recognize this because it allows us to understand and situate all this as, I think, a reaction to something else. And that is something that I think we can appreciate. And I'm not just talking about border militarization here, too. I think we can lump in policies like SB 1070 and other anti-immigrant policy initiatives along with this as well. And I think we can appreciate this point by paying attention, for example, to the career of people like Chris Kobach, who was one of the intellectual architects of SB 1070 through his role at the Center for Immigration Studies, and recently has made a substantive pivot from an anti-immigrant crusader to a pioneer of voter suppression policy and legislation. He spent 4 years as the Secretary of State of Kansas, he was just elected in November as the Attorney General of the state of Kansas. But prior to this, during the Trump administration, he served as the chairperson for the Presidential Advisory Committee on Election Integrity under Trump. And this, I think, connection reveals that there's always been something else at stake in the hysteria around border control and associated anti-immigrant policy. And Arizona has been, of course, as I've mentioned, a battleground for this. And that is, I think, a shifting electoral landscape, which we have observed in the last couple election rounds. And this shifting electoral landscape, I think, is a product of two things, specifically long-term demographic change, which is associated with a lot of these broader global trends that I've been talking about. So Arizona is now becoming Latinx peoples are play a substantial role now in the electoral composition of the state, right? The state's also becoming much younger than it has been. But there's also been, really sustained and important grassroots organizing, some of which I've been talking about. But I'll also just mention the really sustained campaign leading up to 2016 to get Joe Arpaio thrown out of office in Maricopa County, which involved years of door-to-door voter registration and voter mobilization. And I think recognizing these dynamics helps us appreciate what's at stake in both, as I said, these anti-immigrant and voter suppression efforts, which is to say the viability of multiracial democracy. And I think it's worth drawing our attention, for example, to the work of W.B. Du Bois, who gives us an essential set of tools for recognizing these connections over time and the multiple iterations of white supremacist backlash that the struggle for multiracial democracy has faced in this country, which brings me to my final lesson that I want to share with you all, which is that knowledge matters. So somebody really smart, I can't remember his name, once said, people make history, but never under conditions of our choosing. But I think the inverse is also true, that history and geography, meaning places, make people, but never in ways that we can fully understand without study. Without knowing what is happening, how, caused by whom, where have we been, who are our elders, what did they aspire to, how did they fail, how did they succeed? In other words, without knowing where we are and how did we arrive at where we are, we can't then even begin to appreciate, let alone imagine how things could be otherwise, who we could become, let alone how to get there. All of which means that the work of knowledge production and teaching that is done here at this university and in this community, and just as crucially, how we go about that practice of knowledge production is critically important. And not just here. We're fortunate to live in a community with robust infrastructures like Pima College, which was initially created to respond to radical demands for community-engaged education. Here in Tucson, for at least for a period, the public schools maintained a visionary model of ethnic studies education. And when the state undertook a concerted effort to dismantle this educational program, it was students themselves who led the charge to defend their classes and their teachers, even when adults in the struggle let them down. And so I think many of us in this community appreciate the stakes of all of this, and of the critical role of knowledge production and education in sustaining movement and in sustaining the possibility for opening up a different kind of future, not just for Southern Arizona, but for the world as a whole that we live in. And with that, I will conclude my comments and welcome your questions and conversation and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. That was beautifully rendered. Okay, so I'm actually going to exercise my host's prerogative and ask the first question, if I may. So moving to Europe, how do you see your research trajectory changing? And so you're taking these lessons from Tucson with you. What's next for you?
Yeah, that's a doozy. Figuring out an Irish cell phone plan. There is, one of the things that I'm interested in exploring has to do with the, so I'll back up and to kind of set the context for this. I had the privilege in 2019, right before the pandemic, traveling to Greece, to Lesbos Island, which is really on the front lines of the of European border control and border management. And we visited some of the camps that had been set up on Lesbos, which have also been designed in order to produce conditions that are really as difficult as really imaginable in terms of sanitation, in terms of overcrowding, access to healthcare, access to adequate nutrition, let alone things like education for children. And while I was there, I was traveling there as part of a symposium. So one of the people invited to give a keynote to this group of US academics was, at the time, I can't recall his name, but he was a Greek politician who at the time was serving as the European Union Commissioner on migration and citizenship. And he gave this talk to us, and he said, he said, I'm going to have to paraphrase, but he said, I'm really happy to be talking to a group of US academics because we think that the US is the model for what the European Union needs to become, and specifically what Frontex needs to become. He says, my vision for Frontex, which is the European frontline border enforcement agency, says my vision for Frontex in 5 years is to be what the Border Patrol is today, right? So this already speaks to the ways that policymakers in Europe are actively drawing ideas and lessons from the United States and vice versa. I think if you look at some of the safe third-party agreements that were initiated during the Trump administration, and that the Biden administration is now talking about bringing back into being, they operate very similarly to the EU-Turkey agreement that was created when I worry I'll get the year wrong, but after the 2015 so-called European migration crisis. So there's a lot of policy cross-pollination, and it's also obviously the case that the companies involved in providing security technology and consultation and so on, a lot of them are the same companies, right? And there's folks in this room or on this Zoom like Gabe Chavone and Todd Miller who have looked a lot at this, right? So that's one thing that I really want to take advantage of the opportunity of being in Europe, to actually look at how, much of the time these kinds of migration management regimes and border militarization practices are studied in either a national framework or through a regional kind of lens. And I think there's actually a lot of good empirical reason let alone political reason to think about them in relationship with one another and to try to tease apart actually how these things are evolving in tandem, in conversation with each other. So that's one thing. Another thing that is really a pressing issue in Ireland is the system of direct provision that the Irish government has implemented for basically, I mean, explicitly, direct provision has been initiated as a deterrence policy. I mean, when in the policy discussions around the year 2000, 2001, when this program was being debated, the arguments in the Irish Parliament about it had to do with assertions that if Irish asylum policy is weaker than the asylum policies in the UK, that's going to create a magnet for more asylum seekers to come to Ireland, right? And so the logic then being Ireland's asylum policies have to be tougher than the UK's, right? In order to deter people from coming. And so under direct provision, people are barred from working. They are required to live in basically congregate settings that are managed by the government. These aren't detention centers. People are free to come and go, but they become utterly dependent on the Irish state for all of their everyday needs: nutrition, healthcare, obviously housing, and the conditions are also managed in such a way to be as unpleasant, right, as possible. And I think one of the things that I think is really important is that, I mean, on the one hand, there's a legitimate human rights kind of argument to be made about why this model is problematic, right? This program is problematic. But there's also the fact that, like, a huge number of people who go through direct provision, they might lose their asylum case, but you know, there are thousands of people who then stay in Ireland, right? Despite having lost their case. Many will win their case. And all, you know, throughout, you know, people are raising children. Those children might be already or might become Irish citizens. And there's a similar kind of thing here, right? Where you have people living in mixed status households, and you have all these policies that are designed, you know, SB 1070 was also explicitly designed to make life so unpleasant for undocumented people in Arizona that they would self-deport. In the meantime, right, there's all kinds of harm being done to people's families, to their economic conditions, to their overall economic well-being, but also to their there's a lot of psychological damage, emotional damage that's happening that has lifelong repercussions, you know. And so I think, like, that's something that merits studying there as much as it merits studying here. And countries from Italy to Denmark are also embracing similar extremely punitive kinds of asylum policies. So those are also things I intend to take up. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Geoff. We have a lot of questions on Zoom, but I think I'll just take a couple here. So who would like to be first?
Hi, Geoff. It should be no surprise to you that my question is about social reproduction. So in my own personal experience as a labor organizer, I have seen mostly women who are involved in organizing. And a lot of times are also involved in, like, specifically social reproductive work. And so I wanted to ask you, in your experience, the ways you've seen, like, a blend of, like, domestic workers, for example, or people who saw their labor power doing more like social reproductive work, and also the reproduction of these movement spaces. So the reproduction of resistance in order to survive.
Yeah, I think this is that's a great question, and I think it's a fundamental one. It's a politically fundamental one, and I hope that some of my thinking about that came across in my talk earlier, and at least the passing, you know, attention to social reproduction as as a lens, right, a political lens to think about these questions. And part of the reason why I think it's a fundamental question is because it's one that I've observed and experienced, and many people here have also, I'm sure, experienced and observed here in Tucson, right? And I mean, this isn't new, right? I mean, within Mexican American communities, long disenfranchised through Juan Crow policies, dual wage systems within mining and agriculture and so on, right? People had to, in order to deal with issues of disability and childcare, industrial accidents, old age pension, healthcare, and so on, had to produce their own infrastructures premised on relationships of mutual aid and institutions, right, of mutual aid that in a context in which the state had explicitly excluded people from those kinds of infrastructures that are provided through the government, and so and that becomes a bedrock for then additional forms of organizing, and that's been true here in relation to the experiences, at least this is what I've observed, of immigrant communities in the aftermath of all of the anti-immigrant policy that has been unleashed in this state and in this region. When talking about the protection networks, right? I mean, these really began as simple like mutual aid institutions meant to allow people to come up with a plan, essentially, like if a person is arrested by, if a loved one, if a family member is arrested by the Border Patrol, right? Like what's gonna happen with the kids, right? Who's gonna pick them up from school? Who's the next person to like take on custody, right? Over the long term if someone's in detention. How's the family gonna make ends meet, pay the rent, let alone hire an attorney and pay for a bond to get somebody out of detention, right? So these are really like bread and butter, everyday kinds of issues that the protection networks were created to address. But then out of that comes a foundation for all kinds of organizing, protest, direct action, know your rights trainings out in the community that then cumulatively, I think, has played a huge impact in this community. And I shared the graphs on immigration arrests and deportations, right, as just a kind of aggregate, I think, effect of that impact over time. So yeah, I mean, my sort of study of this is limited to those examples, but I think there are many, many others that we could study and learn from, and that are part of the fabric of people's lives, right? And their ability to survive like various kinds of oppression, violence, and insecurity.
Thank you, Geoff. Thank you for that question. Other questions from our studio audience here?
Thank you for this talk today, Geoff. It's an honor to meet you. I wanted to ask you, because the subject of your talk is what lessons this country and the rest of the world can learn from Southern Arizona, and I was wondering if there are some spaces or communities, organizations in this country or the world that you see already kind of in lineage with these lessons, in lineage with Southern Arizona.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thinking nationally, again, going back to the electoral question, there were two states in the 2020 election that went to the Democrats and Biden, well, specifically went to Biden, but also elected Democratic senators that were, I think, a surprise to a lot of people because historically they hadn't, they had voted for Trump and voted for Republicans. And those are Arizona and Georgia, right? And we just had the Georgia runoff election. We've all been paying attention, I imagine, right, to that. And these are both states that have been enacting over the last decade or so pretty aggressive, say, anti-immigrant and voter legislation or voter suppression policies, right? And that those policies have also catalyzed a backlash, right? A grassroots mobilization. And there are organizations like Mi Gente, right, that have been very active in both states, right, in not just like trying to get out the vote in the months leading up to the election, but day in and day out, right, being in the community, building power to address the priorities and needs of Black and Brown communities. And that includes, but is not strictly limited to or focused on things like, you know, voter registration and voter mobilization. But the impact then over time winds up, I think, being really clear when we look at the outcomes, right, of these national elections. So I think that, like, you know, seeing these examples of where, like, the political landscape is substantively changing, right, and it's because of this kind of grassroots mobilization, I think ought to be instructive, you know, for people, regardless of it. Like, if you don't live here, right, if you live in Ohio, for example, right, there's probably things to learn, you know.
Yeah, we have a question online. It's from Marv Waterstone, whom I guess most of you know or have heard about. He says, could you speak a bit about the ways in which immigrant hysteria and scapegoating is a way to mobilize anti-neoliberal and anti-globalization sentiment for fascistic purposes? That is, to divert attention and action away from confrontations with austerity and wild inequality, which are quite legitimate grievances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I'm very persuaded by work by people like Jordan Camp and Christina Heatherton, who have, I think, offered us a alternative genealogy of neoliberalism that I think helps us understand the ascendancy of neoliberalism in the 1970s as itself a backlash against the what at the time I think were transformative, like the transformative power and influence and mobilization of freedom struggles coming out of the like with the Black freedom struggle, a key element of that wave of mobilization. But of course, over time, that led to all kinds of other liberation struggles. You know, the women's movement, the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, right? Sort of also coalescing as part of this really rupture of what was at the time an apartheid system in the United States, and not just in the South, but across the across the country, in the Southwest, in mining and agriculture, and through things like restrictive covenants, and through the way that institutions like the University of Arizona engaged in hiring and admissions, and all of that was thrown into a profound crisis by the mid 1960s and early 1970s, and neoliberalism, I think, and this is like Jordan Camp and Christina Heatherton's argument, like emerges as a backlash against this, and I think if that's true, that also gives us an alternative, like archive and genealogy. I mean, this is where I think the question of lineage and ancestry, right, is really important, because that allows us to then recognize the possibilities that were emergent and that are still latent for organizing the world otherwise, right? And they're in tension, I think, always. And so I guess my point is that I don't think that it makes sense to think about neoliberalism and white supremacy as somehow antagonistic forces in any substantive or meaningful way. And I think actually the battles that we have to fight are against both, and against the ways that each informs the other.
Any other questions from the Zoom audience, Carlos? No. Okay. Questions? Yeah.
Geoff, we are going to miss you so much, but you're going to make an enormous contribution to these discussions and activism in Europe. So all the best. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to the separation of immigrant justice movements and border justice movements. For example, we're in a moment now, and it's a moment that we've been in before, where we're being asked to accept a kind of Faustian bargain for the protection of DACA youth at the expense of billions of dollars more for border militarization and the extension of Title 42 and so on. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about the tendency, it seems like, to see the border as a zone of sacrifice, right, in these politics. Thank you.
Yeah, well, someone really wise once said to me, once described to me, that when we're up against these seemingly immovable systems of violence like the border, it can, and we're trying to fight for transformation and to end these systems, right, and to bring accountability for these systems. It can oftentimes feel like we're bashing our head against the wall, right, against it, you know, and the process of doing so, you know, can give you a real headache, to say the least. Yeah. But, you know, I think it's also like the persistent pounding away, right, to continue with the metaphor, at these, you know, seemingly immovable systems, that is the only possibility for them, if they are ever going to change. That's where it will come from, right? And in the process, you know, fissures and cracks emerge that we can continue to pry at and exacerbate, with the possibility, it's not inevitable, but the possibility that eventually there will be a breakthrough. And, you know, like I said, really, this is somebody very wise, he said this to me, like, it's not inevitable that will happen, but it's the only way it can come about, you know? And yeah, I mean, it's a really, I think when you describe the border as a sacrifice zone, I think that's the right way to think about the way that this region is treated by the national media and by politicians and so on. And yet, this isn't just a kind of like empty place that can be sacrificed without any consequences, you know, that can be treated as collateral. It's a place full of people, full of vibrant communities, and vibrant communities that have been in resistance for, you know, for hundreds of years, and with powerful and important ramifications for the fabric of the country overall. And I've tried to draw out, I think, what some of those that I think have to do with more recent memory. You know, in the aftermath of, in 2012, there was, or I guess it was 2013, there was a another one of these, you know, quote unquote compromise pieces of federal legislation that would have massively militarized the border further, doubling the size of the Border Patrol again in exchange for immigration relief. And a lot of the narrative about how that fell apart had to do with, you know, this idea that Republicans were going to compromise and go along with it never materialized. But I think it's also true, and it was evident to me observing that at the time, that as soon as they threw in the Corker-Hoven Amendment, which included all this border militarization, was a later addition. And as soon as they threw that in, right, the kind of progressive support for that immigration reform package began to fracture. And I think a large reason why that happened was because of voices from here, from Southern Arizona, who began to immediately speak out about what the ramifications of this would be for this community. So I remember being in Detroit. I was a PhD student here at the time doing field work, and I was sitting in a meeting of an immigrant rights organization there, and they were discussing what to do about the Corker-Hoven Amendment and should they continue to support this. And someone stood up and read a joint statement that was drafted by No More Deaths and the Coalición de Derechos Humanos, and signed by like 17 other organizations here, right, as part of their argument against continuing to support this legislation. And I didn't mention to the people in the room that I had helped write that document, but I think it does speak to a political impasse that we, continue to cycle back, that we continue to be stuck within. And I think we have to keep banging our heads against that wall.
I forgot to mention that we have a reception set up outside from University Dining Services. So please stick around. There's some yummy warm drinks and food for us. But we do have some time for a few more questions here. So anyone else from our non-Zoom audience? We have heard nothing from the Northern Hemisphere here. All right.
Thank you, Geoff. That was really amazing. And it's just amazing to see a critical academic who is really bridging these worlds. And it's amazing to see all of these kind of worlds connecting. So thank you for that. It's a beautiful example. My question for you has to do with, you talked about the necessity of, critical knowledge production. So I'm wondering if you have any notes for us on a kind of praxis that we could undertake here as geographers, be that in our teaching or in our work with communities, or in our struggles against our current university that is tending in some very scary directions. So yeah, I would just love to hear what you think the kind of possibilities for activating this kind of work is if we're sitting in an R1 geography department, that kind of space. Thank you.
I don't know. Marx once said, I'll again have to paraphrase, that he was utterly uninterested in telling the people of the future what they should or shouldn't do. And I sort of feel that way about, if I were here at the U of A, I would say I would, and more informed about what's happening. I might have, and also had a stake in that question personally. I might have more insight and ideas to share, but. I do think that I've been privileged, along with an amazing group of colleagues for the last 7 years here to be teaching in a program that is really grounded in the voices, the perspectives, the priorities of communities here in Southern Arizona and in the borderlands, and bringing those into the classroom and using them as a foundation for shaping curriculum. And what's really rewarding as an educator about that is that then I get to continue actually learning and growing through that encounter, through those relationships and in those spaces. And I do think that there's a long history, including here in Tucson, of struggle around the content and structure and purpose of education that I was trying to highlight a little bit, that I think we still have a lot to learn from and that we can draw from for inspiration, for guidance, for ideas, right? For how to, make the process of knowledge production and education, I think, more, if nothing else, more germane to like the needs of like the people who live in this community, right? More responsive to, and actually, providing tools and resources and opportunities and so on for people, for youth, for movements, and so on. And I think that's when education is at its best. It's doing that, right? And so it's if we have a foothold in these institutions, and we have a responsibility to like figure out how to make the most of like whatever power, influence, authority we have in order to shift these institutions in a better direction. And they're highly, this is another one of these walls we can smash our heads against forever and get a big headache. They're, it's like, the University of Arizona, it's like a massive beast of a thing. But, if you're in a classroom, in a department, right, you can do little things. You can push things, and a lot of you are doing that, I'm sure, So that's the work that I think needs to be like held up, celebrated, and we need more of.
I think we had a question down here. Yeah.
Hey, Geoff. Okay. I just want to make a comment.
Yeah.
You know, I was glad to come see you. I don't know why you're going to Ireland. But, I mean, of all places, I mean, I go to Hawaii, never been there. But I do want to thank you for going to Barrio Viejo and building a relationship with us and the families. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. It's been a privilege to actually, I mean, you're someone who I would hold up. You might not think of yourself as an elder, but I think of you as like an elder and a teacher and one of the people who I turn to for inspiration, you know, about like, and for keeping myself humble, like as an educator, as an activist, right? Because I mean, you know a lot better than I do what's going on. So if I need to figure out what's going on, what I need to do, I need to talk to you, you know? And you know that better because you're in the neighborhood talking with families, you know? And, you know, that's, you know, anyway, I'm grateful, you know?
Thank you. Yeah.
Very nice talk, thank you. I have a question about the Ukrainian immigration. If you have some documentation of the differences between, you know, migrating from Latin America or Europe?
Yeah. I think Ukraine is like a really excellent example. I mean, there's obviously, especially early on, related to the US government, things didn't go as well as they could in facilitating people's entry to the country and pursuit of you know, refuge and safety. But you know, that got corrected pretty quickly, and I think the Ukrainian refugee situation, not just in the U.S. but globally, is a great example of how you know, countries can, I think, mobilize resources to provide to facilitate actually. Not just travel and reintegration, or travel and safety, but also access to, like, you know, housing and work and education when there's the political will to do so. And it proves that there's no good reason why the same policies that have been rolled out to bring Ukrainian refugees into the United States and to, like, you know, check in on and take care of people can't be rolled out for all of the folks from Haiti and Mexico and Honduras, et cetera, who are also right now being trapped at the border and forcibly, extra legally repatriated to Mexico. Well, not even repatriated, just sent back to Mexico under Title 42. So I think the Ukraine example is a great one of, I mean, not a perfect example of how migration and asylum and refugee issues can be handled, but certainly a much better model than the paradigmatic one, you know. So it's a proof of concept, right? Anybody who says it can't be done, obviously it can, you know.
Well, that's, oh, Carlos, yeah.
Yeah, we have here from the online audience a note of appreciation and then a question. The kudos is from Jill the Sapien. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. And she says, Geoff, please know that the work that you have been doing is critical to the knowledge and connection of our public health students to the social justice issues in our region.
Thank you, Jill.
And then the question from Jen Calderon. Geoff, how do you anticipate the trajectory of the Arizona mobilizations and even transnational movements shift in relationship to Tom Horne's re-election, given this new demographic of predominantly Latinx youth and the revitalization of the border wall reconstruction under the Biden administration?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I don't want to come off sounding cavalier about this, but you know, when Tom Horne got reelected, I was like, that's it, I'm moving to Ireland, you know. Yeah, I mean, there's a fight, you know, people here have a fight on their hands. Fortunately, I'll call myself as a participant for many years now in many of these struggles. We have a lot of experience in these fights, and we haven't won all of them, but there's a lot to learn from, and absolutely no reason why any of these struggles need to be approached from scratch, right? Right now, there are heroic people who are they've been successfully blockading the illegal border wall construction in Cochise County by the Doug Ducey administration. He was bringing down the shipping containers into first started off in Yuma, now in Cochise County, and people have been stopping it physically, just standing in the way of the bulldozers successfully, and probably will prevent any more of that wall construction, hopefully, until the new governor, Katie Hobbs, is sworn in January. Yeah, I mean, I think we know this is evident, right? That there is a concerted effort nationwide through this attack on quote unquote critical race theory to really gut any foothold that emancipatory education has in public schools in this country, and not just K through 12 schools, but universities. And I don't have the answer to that, right? One strategy is to do what folks were doing in the 60s and 70s before, ethnic studies departments got created, like ethnic studies as a lens, as like an epistemology, right? As a way of thinking, right? Comes out of grassroots struggles nationwide. And that's then through student mobilization, you wind up with enough pressure to create openings where professors start being hired, departments start being opened, right? And maybe we're in another moment where that kind of mobilization is called for, and it's up to students mostly to figure out how to do that, and those of us who are like faculty can be allies and be helpful. And in the meantime, right, like a lot of this educational work since the program in TUSD was dismantled is happening in the community. Right? It's no longer in the public schools, but it's still happening through spaces people are carving out autonomously, and like that, maybe that's another strategy that is worth pursuing. I don't know.
All right. Well, Geoff, on behalf of the School of Geography and the Southwest Center and everyone here and online, I want to thank you hugely, and I just want to say that you make me proud to be a Tucsonan. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.